which is all of you have gathered at the heart of the concerns of the conference, contemporary anti-Semitism and the delegitimization of Israel. I'm Danny Goldhagen, and I will just be up here briefly as we have a panel of people who need little or no introduction. The first thing I should say is that there was a typo in the program, and Ann Majewski, who is listed as the first person in the next panel, is actually, and always has been, a part of our panel, so she'll be speaking during this session. I'll be brief in the introductions. As you know, there are fuller biographies in the program for everyone, and Walter Reich, who has a very attenuated biography, his fuller biography can be found on the George Washington website. The first person will be, I will introduce everyone, and then they will come up and tell you what they have to say about their areas of expertise. The first person is someone who has done more to combat and constrain Holocaust deniers than anyone. There's no doubt about this, and who has done so heroically. And so we are very, very lucky to have Deborah Lipstadt here to speak about the subject about which no one can speak with more authority, and that is the Iranian president, the Canadian professor, the literary journal, and the Holocaust denial conference that never was. Following Deborah is the former head of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, someone who knows from the inside more about the politics of the study of the Holocaust and the nexus of that with the discussion of Israel than probably just about anybody, or certainly up there with anybody, Walter Reich, who will be speaking about the rabbi and the president don't give us the Holocaust at the expense of Israel. Following him, we have Dina Porat, who, in addition to her many publications and achievements, is the director of the Stephen Roth Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism and Racism in Tel Aviv, and who puts out what is probably the single most important annual survey of anti-Semitism around the world, their annual yearbook. And so it can speak as authoritatively as anyone about, are the events in the Middle East indeed the source of the global new anti-Semitism? And finally, we have the person who has done more to keep an eye on the UN, who has a column, a dispatch and analysis of the proceedings and goings-on of the UN with regard to Israel and human rights that is a must-read for anyone who would like to keep up on this subject. It's called Eye on the UN. Ann Majewski, who, with her unparalleled authority on this subject, will be telling us about anti-Semitism and the international human rights system. So we have a full panel, and we'll just get immediately to Deborah with the others following her one after another. Thank you.
The list of attendees at the Iranian Holocaust Denial Conference in December 2006 constituted a virtual who's who of Holocaust deniers and anti-Semites, including Roberto YIISA, one of the leading theorists, so to speak, of the movement, Australian Fred Tobin, whose Adelaide Institute is a bastion of denial activities, former Ku Klux Klan leader David Duke, and Bradley Smith, founder of CODO, Committee on Open Debate on the Holocaust. However, there was one name which caught many people by surprise. Shiraz Dosa, a faculty member at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia, a respected academic institution. It was not his lofty standing in the field of Holocaust studies which surprised people. In fact, few people, certainly those in the field of Holocaust studies, had any idea who he was. What gave people pause was that Dosa was a tenured faculty member at a legitimate academic institution. Was this, I wondered, an Arthur Butz redux? Butz, who teaches at Northwestern, is the professor of electrical engineering, whose book, The Hopes of the 20th Century, tried to cloak denial in an academic garb. This might be, some people surmised, even more disturbing than the Butz situation, since Butz is an electrical engineer, and as one pundit quipped, he knows as much about the Holocaust as I do about building bridges, and who has no ostensible expertise in Holocaust history. Dosa, on the other hand, was a political philosopher, and as such was at least obliquely an irrelevant. Shiraz Dosa, a Google search quickly revealed, had an MA and PhD from the University of Toronto. Born, according to his rather self-deprecating St. Francis Xavier webpage, in an unnamed, quote, multiracial British colony in Africa, close quote, has apparently published one book on Hannah Arendt's political philosophy, which contains approximately 8 pages on the Holocaust. Though Dosa describes himself as an Holocaust expert or scholar, his list of publications contains few or any items related to the topic. Upon his return to Canada, this conference seems to have a strange Canadian theme, for better and now for worse. Upon his return to Canada, he was subjected to a barrage of criticism from many quarters, including the leadership of his university, who described his participation in the conference as abhorrent. Dosa claimed that he was surprised to find that this was a denial conference, and dismissed the deniers who were there as, quote, hacks and lunatics. His claim to have been unaware that this was a Holocaust denial conference led John Ibbotson, a columnist in the Globe and Mail, to declare that Dosa was either an idiot or lying. And Ibbotson called for Dosa's firing. A few months later, Dosa struck back with an extensive essay in a small but apparently respected online journal, the Literary Review of Canada. Using language that was pregnant with religious overtones, he lamented the, quote, Spanish Inquisition and Crusade sanctioned by the school and designed to denounce him, a Muslim scholar and Muslim Holocaust scholar. He added, in a seemingly parenthetical observation, who also happens to be an outspoken critic of Israel's brutality in occupied Palestine. The crusade was, he charged, launched by 2 Jewish professors and the Christian chair of the political science department. His use of the term crusade to stress on the religious identity of the so-called inquisitors, and his emphasis that this fight was launched against a Muslim professor were not inconsequential. Even the cover of the journal, which proclaimed a Muslim scholar speaks his mind, picked up on the theme of religious identity. Though designed to be a brief on his own behalf, the essay in fact provides insight in what might have motivated this professor of political theory to participate in such a gathering. The essay alters Dosa's attendance at the conference from an enigma to something rational, if not quite logical. After reading his essay, his participation in the gathering no longer confounded me. Other aspects of this episode, however, remain quite baffling. Now first, a couple of things about his essay itself. Dosa begins by challenging what he describes as 2 fallacies about Ahmadinejad. One, was that he threatened to wipe Israel off the map, and the second, that he was a Holocaust denier. In a paragraph that is either very poorly edited or designed to obfuscate, Dosa writes, the anti-intellectual storm at St. Francis was driven by 2 fallacies pushed by the media and the literati. The first is that Iran's president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, has dismissed the Holocaust as a myth and threatened to wipe Israel off the map. In fact, this is Dosa speaking, Ahmadinejad has not denied the Holocaust or proposed Israel's liquidation. He has never done so in any of his speeches on the subject, all delivered in Farsi. As an Iranian specialist, I can attest that both accusations are false. And then his proof, and then his further support. He goes on to say, American Iran experts such as Ron Cole and UK journalists such as Jonathan Steele have come to the same conclusion. While Ahmadinejad's statements about wiping Israel off the map has been challenged by both Cole and Steele, both of whom go to great linguistic lengths to try to make it sound benign, make Ahmadinejad sound benign, neither of them have had anything to say about Ahmadinejad's Holocaust denial. It is unclear whether Professor Dosa wants his readers to believe that Cole and Steele have also challenged the idea that Ahmadinejad is a denier, which they have not, or is he simply expressing himself in a very sloppy fashion. Dosa then goes on to claim that Ahmadinejad has not denied the Holocaust. He has never done so. While he acknowledges that Ahmadinejad's language has been excessive and provocative, he seems to suggest that this is a rational, if not laudatory, characteristic. Quote, he does not really care what we in the West think about Iran or Muslims. He does not kowtow to Western or Israeli diktat. Close quote. According to Dosa, Ahmadinejad has been questioning the mythologizing, the sacralization of the Holocaust, and raises doubts about its scale. Repeatedly in the essay, Dosa refers not to Holocaust denier, but to Holocaust denial/skepticism. Since skepticism is precisely the approach scholars are supposed to adopt, Dosa's use of the term suggests that deniers are part of the scholarly enterprise. Dosa is not, of course, the first one to try to depict deniers as simply inquisitive folks. He is, in fact, echoing the claim deniers have been making for the past 30 years. Calling themselves, quote-unquote, revisionists, they insist that their primary objective is to correct mistakes in history. They wish to be thought of as, quote, an other side in the scholarly conversation about the Holocaust. Dosa's use of the term denial/skepticism is designed to further this goal. It is interesting to note, just as an aside, that deniers themselves may be gravitating away from use of the term revisionist, precisely because it has become so closely linked to denial. For their purposes, it's become almost toxic. In his report on the Iran conference, Australian Holocaust denier Fred Tobin includes the following caption in bold: "Note, conference theme, a review, not a revision of the Holocaust." Not surprisingly, Dosa tries to give Ahmadinejad cover by claiming that Ahmadinejad is doing exactly what the Jewish scholars, other Jewish scholars such as Tom Segev, have been doing for years. As critical as Segev has been about Israeli politics, he has never, ever echoed anything of Ahmadinejad's sentiments about the Holocaust. But again, it's an attempt to give themselves cover as scholarly skeptics. Then Dosa goes on to argue that not only is Ahmadinejad not a liar, but this wasn't a Holocaust denial conference. It was, in fact, a, quote, global South conference designed to devise an intellectual political response to Western Israeli intervention in Muslim affairs, not Western. He asserts that the presence of a, quote, few notorious Western Christian deniers/skeptics, a couple of neo-Nazis, were used to brand the conference as a denial gathering, when in fact Holocaust deniers were a fringe element. Was this indeed a global conference on Western Israeli intervention in Muslim affairs? Judging from a copy of the program, and you have here just a few of the people. Okay, forget it. The long list shows, and I'm just going to show you the list of topics, and of course over 1/3 of them are direct in the title. Hala hoax, Treblinka was not a death camp, the Holocaust demography, talk on the scientific lack of basis for the 6 million figure, gas chamber fraud. Anybody could read this program and then say that this is not a Holocaust denial conference, is either, as Ibbotson said, a liar or an idiot. But it was not just the papers and the participants that give the lie to Dosa's claims about the nature of the gathering. Even the exhibits, there were exhibits too. As one reporter described them, they largely supported the view the Holocaust did not take place or was exaggerated. They had pictures, and next to each picture was myth, truth, myth, truth. A student at Tehran University who helped set up the exhibition told the press between 150,000 and 300,000 Jews died because of natural causes of war, such as famine and air raids. Unfortunately, Iranian schools still teach the official history dictated by the West, but we are campaigning to change that. Then Dosa goes on to argue that the Iranian government didn't sponsor the conference, but it was sponsored by a political science think tank in Iran. When you go on the website of the political science think tank, the logo shows right underneath a unit of the foreign ministry of Iran. So that also sets things, clearly puts the lie to Dosa's claim. Finally, Dosa protests in his essay, there was no way he could have known that a few deniers would be in attendance. In fact, in January 2006, fully 11 months before the conference, a spokesman for the foreign ministry in Iran told the press this would be a conference to examine the scientific basis supporting the Holocaust. He goes on to later to say, right before the conference, The Holocaust is not a sacred issue that one cannot touch. I have visited Nazi camps in Eastern Europe. I think it is exaggerated. This is coming from the Foreign Ministry. And finally, even Al Jazeera, is a source that those who might find more trustworthy than Canada's Globe and Mail, reported that this was going to be a Holocaust denial conference. In the essence of his essay, Dosa argues that the virulent attack on him for attending the conference was motivated by Islamophobia. He says it began with two Globe and Mail journalists whom he describes in decidedly non-academic language as, quote, dilettantes extraordinaire on the Holocaust in the Middle East, who got most things wrong, displayed cerebral deficits, and were intellectually just a cut above the trailer park boys, to whom the paper has given unlimited latitude, this is the journalist, not the trailer park boys, to trash Muslims even as they defend civilization, Israel, and Jews. Then he goes on to say that the attack on him by the university was a way of the university showing that it's on the side of the Jews and not on the side of the Muslims. He then goes on to argue that Ahmadinejad didn't attend the conference. Of course, there are pictures of him attending he didn't attend, the conference went to him, and of course he gave official welcome, etc., etc. So again, that is completely a fallacy in Dosa's claims. But the heart of the matter is what happened afterwards. First of all, this essay is published in the Literary Review of Canada, and he is given support by the Canadian Association of University Professors, which is far more important, because Dosa ultimately is an irrelevant and unimportant figure who seems to have earned more column inches and attention by his few days in Tehran than anything he has done, certainly in the scholarly realm. Rather than simply saying, I went and I made a mistake, he has engaged in a convoluted effort to rewrite history and cast himself as a victim of so-called Islamophobia. His attempt to refashion the truth, as comical as it is at times, is in fact more important than his presence at this gathering. It constitutes what I've termed soft-core denial. Soft-core denial is more nuanced and amorphous than outright denial. The outright denial one hears from people like Corey Son or David Irving. By contending that people such as Ahmadinejad are not engaging in denial, Dosa is trying to politicize any criticism of Ahmadinejad and his cohorts. It is not, he seems to be arguing, but a means of attacking Muslims and defending Israel. But far more disturbing, and this is really the heart of the argument, than Dosa's response was the behavior of the Literary Review of Canada, which published the essay, and CAUT, the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which issued a strong statement in support of Dosa. The reporter for the Globe and Mail who covered the essay, Dosa's essay, called it compelling. When the Literary Review of Canada published Dosa's essay, it accompanied it with an introductory note in which the editors observed that 4 months after the conference and the controversy over his participation, Dosa wanted to tell his version of the story. The editors then proceeded to note that his version included, and this I quote from the editors of the review, the real purpose of the conference, not Holocaust denial, who organized it, not Dr. Ahmadinejad, they gave him a PhD, who attended, and what he thought and felt about the all-out attack on him back home in Canada, particularly from the Globe and Mail and from his own university, St. Francis. At the Literary Review of Canada, we read his manuscript, which seemed to us to be a serious exploration of the right of academic freedom in Canada and who gets to exercise that right. After rigorous fact-checking that went on for a number of weeks, we agreed that the essay was ready for publication. Remember, fact-checking of A, this wasn't a Holocaust denial conference, B, Ahmadinejad didn't have anything to do with it, C, Ahmadinejad wasn't there, there were a few lunatics, etc. This is fact-checking, which of course I, in 3 minutes on Google, showed that they were completely, well, I guess to quote the Globe and Mail, either idiots or liars. Certainly the so-called extensive fact-checking the LRC conducted should have revealed all these things. One would have expected it to have at least recognized some of the more evident fabrications. Equally, if not more disturbing, was the statement by the CAUT, which as of this morning has 65,000 members, so it's not a small organization, which was issued right after the conference. It cast the controversy over Dosa's attendance in academic terms, and contended that the reaction to his attendance at the gathering, quote, raises fundamental questions about academic freedom. CAU2 was reacting at least in part to a call by Globe and Mail columnist, that Dosa be fired. It's important to note that Dosa's university, while castigating his attendance, acknowledged his academic freedom even as it condemned his participation. CAUT insisted that universities can only serve the public interest through the advancement of knowledge if they are places open to the widest diversity of viewpoints and perspectives. Places where criticism and debate, not silence and suppression, are the response to perspectives with which one disagrees. Close quote. Since the topic of the conference was so clearly Holocaust denial, it is strange that the CAUT should see this solely as a matter of academic freedom and not academic integrity. Why was CAUT not disturbed by the participation of one of its members in a gathering whose premise is based on falsehoods and lies? Why did it not, even as it acknowledged his right to be there, raise questions about why a university teacher would participate in something that is so clearly intended to distort the truth? When Dosa returned to Canada, James Turk, the executive director of the CAUT, rose to his defense, casting his words in the context of academic freedom, which he defined as, quote, the right of academic staff to speak the truth as they see it, without repression from the institution, the state, religious authorities, special interest groups, or anyone else, close quote. Turk, the head of the CAUT, compared the way in which Professor Dosa was treated to the 1950s McCarthy period in the United States, which many people feared attending events that were unpopular. Turk chastised those who engaged in, quote, an aggressive attempt based on very little information to denigrate Professor Dosa and to vilify her. It seems strange for the head of an organization dedicated to university teaching to come so aggressively to the defense of a professor who chose to attend a conference attended by people who not only deny the Holocaust, but also deny the horrors of the American slave trade. Read David Duke. The LRC concluded its comments about Professor Dosa with a rather self-congratulatory paragraph. Academic freedom, like all freedom of speech issues, calls on thoughtful citizens to broaden their horizons. It's always individuals who are raising uncomfortable ideas that the majority would rather not hear, who end up excoriated or denigrated in the media, and who are left twisting in the wind by the institutions where they work. Reading Shiraz Dosa's essay gives us all the opportunity to confront some important and controversial ideas that go to the heart of our identity as a multicultural nation. We hope you agree. It is noteworthy that these two intellectual and scholarly entities describe the gathering as propagating, quote, important and controversial ideas intended to, quote, broaden horizons, close quote. The LRC, and to somewhat lesser degree the CAUT, seem to believe that Professor Dosa deserves to almost be lauded for participating in such a gathering. Though Dosa was subjected to a barrage of criticism, he was not fired or demoted. In fact, the statements castigating him, issued by the president of St. Francis and by his colleagues, specifically took note of his right to attend. It is unclear why this criticism violates the notion of academic freedom. Had this been a conference devoted to rewriting the history of American slavery as a great boon to Africans because they got to live in the United States, as a conference participant David Duke argues, would the case be that the LRC and the CAUT would be rallying to Dosa's defense? While deniers may have been pleased by the conference, they should be ecstatic by the CAUT and LRC's comments. To call Holocaust denial an uncomfortable idea is to ignore the fact that deniers lie, distort, obfuscate in order to make their arguments. For years, deniers have sought academic and scholarly equity with little success. To have their ideas called, quote, important and controversial, close quote, is more than they could have hoped for. Of the LRC and the CAUT, the best that can be said of their reactions, in the words of some unknown pundit, their minds were so open, their brains fell out. Surely the head of the CAUT, since the head of the CAUT referred to the McCarthy hearings to defend Dosa, it is fitting to close by again citing those hearings. To paraphrase a very brave American lawyer, Joseph Welch, who called Senator McCarthy to account after his long rampage on American freedoms, it is appropriate to say, not to Professor Dosa, about whom the answer seems evident, but to the CAUT and the editors of the LRC, have you no sense of decency? Have you no shame? Their responses to the conference can be contrasted with that of an Iranian journalist who, while standing outside the conference, lamented, quote, "It makes me ashamed, so ashamed," close quote. That journalist may be one of the few people to have emerged from this affair with his honor intact. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah. Now we have Walter Wright.
I want to begin as many at this conference. Can people hear me and have a soft voice? As many people in this conference have begun by congratulating Charles Small and YIISA. When I first came to YIISA to give a talk a couple of years ago, I told Charles that, having been here at Yale for some years, I was astonished at what he was building, and that it was really even possible, given various resistances to such an effort. And I think he's been able, through skill, to actually create something of great scholarly importance and great importance in the world. On May 1, 1978, that's before some of you were born, probably. Some 600 Jewish leaders gathered on the south lawn of the White House. They were there to mark the 30th anniversary of Israel's birth. Most of them were rabbis. I guess it goes without saying that almost all of them were men. That might not be the case today. The day was clear and cool. The guests sang the Israeli national anthem and the Star-Spangled Banner. Menachem Begin, Israel's prime minister at that time, had come to the U.S. for a speaking tour to commemorate the founding of his country. And the White House decided to invite him for a talk with President Jimmy Carter. In all, 1,200 Jewish leaders had been invited. That only 600 came was a poor showing for this grand occasion. Which Jewish leader wouldn't want to be there, and which wouldn't want to have a photo of himself shaking the president's hand? But two reasons could have explained the low turnout. First of all, the Carter-Bacon meeting itself. Thank you. I'm not going to touch it again. Great. Two reasons might have explained the low turnout. First of all, the Carter-Bacon meeting itself had been arranged just a few days earlier, as had been the South Lawn ceremony, giving the invitees little time to make travel arrangements. Probably more importantly, the feelings of America's Jewish community toward Carter had turned quite sour. Carter had just decided to sell 60 advanced F-15 warplanes to one of Israel's enemies, Saudi Arabia, and 30 other warplanes to Egypt, leaving some Jewish leaders, presumably, reluctant to pay Carter obeisance by appearing instantly at his bidding. Yet the crowd that did come seemed jubilant, expectant, and by some reports pleased with themselves for having been chosen for the invitation. A number of them had declined to attend a demonstration at the White House to protest the arms sales to the Arabs. At 1:30, Begin drove up to the entrance of the White House's West Wing in a limousine and was greeted by a grinning Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, who had been blamed by some Jews for what they saw as the Carter administration's tilt toward the Arab states. During the 30 minutes of the Begin-Carter meeting, the waiting guests on the lawn drank coffee and punch. One of the guests, Rabbi Avi Weiss, described in the Washington Post's report of the event as, quote, an intense young rabbi from Riverdale, which is a neighborhood in the Bronx, handed out copies of a letter he had written to Carter. It opposed in polite language the proposed sales of warplanes to Saudi Arabia and to Egypt. Finally, Carter and Begin showed up on the South Lawn. Carter announced that he was appointing a commission to recommend to him ways of memorializing the Holocaust, a commission that eventually recommended the creation of, among other things, the Holocaust Museum. It's very unlikely that Carter had such a large and permanent institution in mind when he announced the creation of the commission. He might have thought they'd recommend a statue or a ceremony, but in any case, coming soon after the airing of the 1978 NBC miniseries Holocaust, seen by about 120 million Americans and ultimately by some 220 million viewers in the US and Europe, and welcomed by the country's Jews, this seemed like an effective way to mollify an important Democratic Party constituency. After all, 70% of voting American Jews had cast their ballots for him. Because of that lopsided percentage, he won New York State, Ohio, and the national election. In announcing the Commission on the Holocaust, Carter described the Holocaust as, quote, the ultimate in man's inhumanity to man. After Begin spoke about the Jews' struggle for survival and freedom, the crowd sang, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live. The receiving line that formed to shake hands with Carter included the rabbi from the Bronx. Weiss later recalled, as I waited my turn, I wondered whether I could speak truth to power. Memorizing the words I wanted to say to the president in fear that I'd freeze when meeting him, I finally clasped his hand and said, I was one of your strongest supporters, but I'm outraged by your disastrous tilt toward the Arabs. And Mr. President, don't give us the Holocaust at the expense of Israel. The president looked incensed, but I felt good, and access had not prompted me to compromise my principles. In that dramatic moment, that young and intense rabbi understood something that few other Jews, rabbis or not, communal and organization leaders, or not, have understood. He understood that the Holocaust could serve for national and international statesmen as a political sop. He understood that a bow to Holocaust memory would be greeted automatically with gratitude by Jews who wanted non-Jews to understand, or at least recognize, the reality of the immense atrocity that had befallen the Jewish people. And he understood that even a government or international organization that had had done something to threaten the existence of the Jewish state could, by recognizing the Holocaust and talking about its memory in lofty terms, immunize itself from the accusation that it was endangering and in extreme circumstances ignoring, condoning, or even endorsing lethally intentioned hostility toward the Jewish state. Those who know anything about that young and intense rabbi, and I do, not least because I happen to be his brother-in-law, know that no one has been more committed than he to the honest preservation of Holocaust memory. It was this rabbi who in 1989 demonstrated against the use as a convent of a building at the Auschwitz death camp that had been used to store canisters containing the crystals of Zyklon B, the very crystals that the Germans had tossed into the gas chambers of the crematoria, in which well over 90% of the victims had been Jews. He saw the creation of that convent as part of an attempt to transform the memory of Auschwitz into a place of Polish Catholic martyrdom. Many Poles were indeed murdered at Auschwitz, but the primary purpose to which the Germans put it was to exterminate those European Jews who had not already been gassed in the other death camps, or starved in ghettos, or shot in extermination pits. YIISA saw the convent as part of an attempt to change historical memory, and he went there to protest that attempt. He made many other protests regarding the desecration of Holocaust memory. Clearly, he's committed much of his life to preserving that memory so that it would be true to Holocaust history. Yet, back in 1978, he wasn't willing to accept the sop that Carter had used as a political strategy to enable him to do what YIISA believed would endanger Israel. For him, the memory of dead Jews was sacred. For the survival of living Jews, the Jews of Israel, including the many Holocaust survivors who were still alive at that time, was immensely more important. And for YIISA and others, those living Jews are still more important than the lofty words often uttered as rote platitudes by world leaders in memory of the Holocaust dead, especially if those words ignore or serve to mask the efforts of other leaders to eliminate the Jewish state. Which is why many are wary of the crop of commemorations, resolutions, and exhibitions that have emerged in recent years from the UN. For example, in 2005, the UN commemorated the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. During that same year, the General Assembly rejected the denial of the Holocaust as an historical event. In 2007, its Secretary General established an International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. And in February of that year, its Department of Public Information's Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program collaborated with the International Raoul Wallenberg Foundation on the Partners of Hope concert at Carnegie Hall. In themselves, of course, those commemorations are laudable, and many of the speeches made at them were quite moving. So it's not surprising that some Jewish organizations, as well as many Jews, including Holocaust survivors, have been touched by the UN-sponsored Holocaust remembrance events and grateful to the world body for having carried them out. But the fact that these attacks have been carried out by an institution, many of whose members have for decades unrelentingly hijacked the UN's bureaucratic machinery to demonize the Jewish state, and in recent years have increased the virulence of the UN's focused attacks on Israel, makes those commemorations, resolutions, and exhibitions almost insignificant, and at worst has served to mask the UN's constant attacks and make the organization seem balanced and reasonable. That the leader of one of those members, as we've heard so many times at this conference, has even threatened to wipe Israel off the map, as Deborah Lipstadt again reminded us. That he heads a country that is frantically building nuclear weapons that could do just that, and is warmly applauded by a large segment of the UN when that leader addresses it, even as he excoriates the Jewish state and rejects its right to exist, highlights the hypocrisy, even the bitter mockery, that Holocaust commemorations have sometimes become. This is no small matter. Those one-sided attacks, organized by the UN's bloc of 56 Islamic states, and supported by an automatic bloc of additional, quote, non-aligned states, whose votes are captive to the power of the Islamic states, are constantly cited by Arab and Muslim countries, as well as by terrorist groups, as proof that Israel is a demonic country, that it's the only violator of human rights in the world, and that it doesn't have the right to exist. In some cases, they're cited as proof that not only Israel, and not only Israeli Jews, but all Jews don't have the right to exist. You've heard this again and again. I will just cite a few examples. One of the people, probably the person most expert in this, is sitting here, will be on the panel, and will, I suspect, tell us more, but I'll just mention a few examples. In 2007, and of course I mean YIISA, in 2007, only a few countries were criticized by the General Assembly, and in no case by more than a single resolution. Israel, on the other hand, was the target of 22 one-sided resolutions. In 2006-07, all of the 11 condemnatory resolutions passed by the UN Human Rights Council, which were supposed to have been an improvement over the obsessively anti-Israel UN Human Rights Commission, which embarrassed even UN staff members, were against Israel, all of them. None of them were against any of the remaining 191 member states of the UN, including Sudan, I don't have to talk about Darfur, China, with its child slavery and repression of Tibetans, and many other human rights violations, Saudi Arabia, with its severe religious intolerance, beheadings, and anti-female discrimination, Iran, with its execution of homosexuals and calls for the elimination of a member state of the UN, and a host of other countries that have murdered or suppressed their own populations. Also, in that year, the Human Rights Council created one agenda item that is permanent: the, quote, human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab countries, Arab territories. Again, despite the fact that the human rights situation in numerous countries are far more serious. In 2005, two UN bodies, the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization, each passed only one resolution against a specific country, Israel. At one time, I'm not sure this is still the case, the busiest corridor of the UN's European headquarters in Geneva was lined with 10 posters devoted to the victimization of Palestinians by Israel. And I'm going to just mention a couple of other examples of many, many I could cite. A number of permanent organizations have been set up within the UN, several with large staffs that constantly spew out anti-Israel messages. The Special Committee to Investigate Israeli Practice, this is the title of the committee, a special committee to investigate Israeli practices affecting the human rights of the Palestinian people and other Arabs of the occupied territories, which was established in 1968. The General Assembly's Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People and the UN Secretariat's Division for Palestinian Rights, which has a staff of 16. The UN's International Day of Solidarity with Palestinian People in 2005 was marked by a map in which Palestine replaced Israel. And in the most striking recent moment of anti-Israel frenzy by a UN organ, the Human Rights Council's Durban Review Conference in April 2009 in Geneva, the very same Iranian president, Ahmadinejad, gentleman that you've heard several times at this conference, addressed that week-long meeting. I should say that when in 1978, Jimmy Carter played the Holocaust card in order to mollify his Jewish critics and mask his acts that endangered the Jewish state, at least he set in motion the creation of what was ultimately an important result, the Holocaust Museum. At the UN, though, the Holocaust card, the occasional commemorations and exhibitions evoking the memory of the Holocaust dead, are unlikely to have any redeeming outcomes. One wishes that a young, intense rabbi would at some Holocaust memorial ceremony tell the UN's Secretary General, don't give us the Holocaust at the expense of Israel. But sadly, even if he did, and even if the Secretary General were to respond sympathetically, it's unlikely that the UN member states that are busy undermining Israel's existence would, even during some obligatory moment of silence, stop their efforts to delegitimize the Jewish state, or that other states would break their silence and do what they should do to prevent a Holocaust to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. And now we have Dina Paul.
Good morning. Thank you for having invited me. Thank you, Charles, for all the good work. Let me have a good look at the watch. Thank you. That's it. I had, of course, a paper ready, but having heard Ruth Weiss yesterday, I changed it a bit because I'm very glad Ruth is here. We all like to thank you again for a most compelling and penetrating lecture that you have given us. But I changed my paper because I felt your words were not an accusation, I would say, but a challenge, okay? A challenge that you were pointing at a challenge that we did not face yet. And I would like, if possible, to divide my words into two. One is the topic I had, and this is indeed the Middle East, and especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the source of anti-Semitism as many claim it to be. And then I would like to add a part that says in which context events of the Middle East are explained or perceived that way as the source of anti-Semitism. What is the context in which this anti-Semitism rises, and by that to bring up not an answer, but a feeling that I have since your presentation yesterday, and this is that you see, what is, if you come to think about it and try to crystallize it, what is anti-Semitism? It's the discrepancy between what is the Jew in reality and the Jewish state in reality, and the imaginary image, the capabilities, colossal capabilities that the Jew is perceived to have. This is the essence of anti-Semitism, and this is what I would like to, with your permission, to get at. I would like to suggest, regarding the first part, in which I would like to question whether the Middle East is indeed the source. And sometimes you, of course, see obviously that it is. There is a caste-led operation, and immediately there is a wave of anti-Semitic activities. There was the beginning of the Second Intifada, and I won't go far back, but the Second Intifada, and immediately you had a large wave, an extensive wave of anti-Semitic activities, manifestations, etc. So it's so obviously linked. But let me suggest, and offer a few points, let me suggest that the Middle East is the match, perhaps the match, if I can use that image, that lights the fire. But the woods for the fire lie somewhere else. And they lie mainly in Europe of today, and its own problems, its own developments in international, cultural, economic, social, political developments that do not originate in the Middle East, that do originate where the woods are, and these are the woods that are in Europe. First of all, well, nasty pictures you have seen enough. My first point is that when you look at what we have done in almost 20 years in the Stephen Roth Institute at Tel Aviv University, and thank you, Danny, for your kind words about our annual report, which I hope helps clarify the picture. You see, these are the major violent events since '89 and until about a year ago, 2009. And you see they are on the rise, though they have ups and downs. Okay. First point is that we could linger on this diagram for a long time, but let me state it briefly that if you take, if you look at the year and you look at the line, you would see that it comes up and down many times according to events that were outside the Middle East or have an indirect connection. For instance, in 1991, the first rise in this decade had to do with the first Gulf War. It wasn't the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it was the first Gulf War. Then you see in the middle, I'm just giving examples, you see in the middle of the 90s, you see a more or less stable line between 94 and 96-7. And this is because before that you saw the rise in 93, this was in correlation with activities against foreign workers, minorities coming into Europe, suffering attacks against them, such as Roma, Yugoslav, you name them, they were attacked, and at the same time there was a correlation between attacks against them and attacks against Jews. But it started with them. And then polices and parliamentarians decided to have this public disorder stopped, put many of the perpetrators in prisons, etc., and then you stamped hard on them, and then you had a few more quiet years against the Jews as well. Okay? Then you had a rise that we think, well, that's about this we are less sure. I'm saying we because we are a large staff and we have about 55 people sending the material to us from all over, and this is the time to thank Mike Wine for many long years of friendship and collaboration. Jewish property. You remember the 95 opening of the archives, and a few years after, when documents became clearer, and the demand to have Jewish property back, restored and returned, also gave rise. And then you had, again, second Durban, and first Durban, second Intifada, etc. So events, manifestations against Jews were all along linked to other events that have a direct effect on the manifestation against Jews. Moreover, if such a correlation between Middle East events and anti-Semitic manifestations was really there, was the basic reason, then countries where there is a large Muslim community and a connection to the Middle East should have been on top of the list. But sometimes they are not. Sometimes they are not. You can see. I skip this. Yeah, these are Canada rising. In United Kingdom has been for many years the one with the largest number, France. These are other countries. Have a look at Russia and the Ukraine. I'll go back to the one with the United Kingdom. In other words, why Russia? If this is the Middle East, Russia and the Eastern countries do not have a large Muslim community, and they are not necessarily involved in the Middle East as such. Canada, a lot has been connected to what happens in Quebec, where Jews wouldn't like to separate themselves from and have an independent French-speaking part, and therefore they are labeled as traitors against their neighbors. So in every place that you touch, you have the local problems and not always necessarily connected to the Middle East. Also the source of immigrants. They could be Muslims, but from Pakistan and India they come to England, from Turkey to Germany. And there was a good report in France showing how they come from Central Africa, the Caribbean, to France. Don't have necessarily any connection to the Middle East. The connection is made by what our colleagues have shown us yesterday, using the Middle East in order to crystallize identity and to capture the youngsters. But this is again not deriving from the Middle East. Also, here it is. You see the coming up and down. Had it been the Middle East only, or even mainly, then it would have come up in the wake of an event, okay, in the Middle East, but then it had to come down, because the event is over. But it comes down not to the formal level. It's still upper than it had been before the event, which means that other reasons and other layers are there and they are not necessarily connected to the Middle East, but come, as we've said, are a result of local and global and economic, etc. Problems, which I'll address in a minute. We've thought a lot about it, and I think the graph shows that when it comes down, does not come down to the formal level. One more point that I would say, I hate to tell you, or it was difficult for us to face it. And this definition of difficult to face, I think accompanies a lot of what we have heard yesterday. And because you see sometimes the reality is harsh and threatening, and it's hard to face. What I'm speaking about is that what we saw while monitoring what happened during Castled gave us the thought, and then we checked it, that once before Castled, that is January 2009 mainly, what you had was something happened, and then there was a reaction, okay? And the question is whether these were the woods or the match that leads the reaction. In Castled, it wasn't a reaction to events that happened, or to what the IDF did, or to what Israel did. In Castled, the wave was prepared before. It was pre-prepared, and it waited for the match. And you could see it, or the thought was for us clarified, the assumption was clarified for us when we took a good look at many photos of demonstrations that took place at the time. Demonstrations were similar, slogans were similar, organizers sometimes were similar, and I'd like very much to go back to what Ruth Weiss stirred in me yesterday. And this is that, what is the context that allows, first of all, the belief that this is the Middle East, namely the accusation that this is the Middle East or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and what is the context that not only allows but builds these woods that are set there for the fire. Well, first of all, the general context, of course, I'll be squeezing in matters that you know and offer one more idea that the context, of course, is the Europe that is hungry for working hands, is aging in itself, needs the simple working hand, because I'm speaking mainly about Central and Western. In Eastern Europe, you do not have, with their kind of economy, the economy that they have, you don't have so many immigrants. So it's the context of an aging, thirsty for working hands society, the industrialized society. And the other part of the context is, of course, the oil money that is pouring from the Middle East into Europe and into North America as well, buying chairs in universities, buying positions, giving youngsters good education, building a Muslim and other, but we are speaking about the Muslims mainly, young, able leadership that is now second and then third generation will build its way into the academia, the media, government. This is how the Islamization of UN institutes comes about, and this is the second part of the context. The working hands and, of course, the money. I had the honor, it wasn't a pleasure, but I had the honor of being a member of the Israeli Foreign Ministry delegation to Durban 1. We were a very small delegation. I was sitting alone. I was the only one from Israel in the room, the chairperson was Iranian, okay? And he did what he liked. My chances, that was at the right moment. My chances to defend the clause in the draft, the Holocaust should never be forgotten or denied, which Arab countries would wish to take out, and they had to defend it against the wish to put a lowercase h, Holocaust, and s at the end, Holocausts, okay, were very slim. I did what I could. This is a different story, but believe me, he gave the floor to all 54 states members in the Muslim, in the Arab League and the Muslim Union before and then he said, Gewalt, there is just 1 more minute left. Israel, you have a minute to explain to us why the Holocaust should. Okay, so what I would like to suggest is that we have been dealing a lot with the able work of our friends and colleagues yesterday, and we've learned so much about the Islamists and the anti-Semitism and built-in anti-Semitism in what they do. I would like to suggest that the spread of their anti-Semitic activity and the rise in manifestations that you've seen is possible because of meeting points between them and between them and their interests and interests of parts mainly in Western Central Europe. And if not for the weren't it for the meeting points, the reality would have been different. So I'm suggesting not to deal with Islamists in separate, but only in the context of meeting points. And I would like to state 2. I'm okay? Okay. I'd like to state 2 of them. One is the meeting points between Islamists and radical left, and sometimes not so radical left. You would be right to say that the left is so different and it's not a necessary, that this pact is absurd, and etc., etc. But both sides, Islamists and radical left, have a long line of meeting points about which they agree. And I will state them very briefly. They are both anti-Americans in Europe. They are anti-globalization, because the economy, as perceived in the Arab countries, is not, it is that modernization and the women work, etc., is contrary to Islam. So they're anti-Americans, they're anti-globalization. They are certainly, suddenly, both sides anti-racist. The left, of course, but okay, they're anti-racist, they're anti-fascist, and they're anti-colonials, post-colonials. You have a certain type that you can see in these UN conferences, where you have the diplomats, that's one word, and you have the NGOs, that's another word. And you can see this type of an idealist young person for whom the vacuum of ideals in our recent world, the vacuum of ideals that has to be filled, is being filled by this being anti-this, this, and that. It's a certain type of a person, idealist originally, okay? But his activity is channeled to support the anti-Israel case, and looking for symbols and looking to filling the vacuum. You can take them out to demonstrations, finding a symbol of evil working against it, finding a symbol of suffering, that's the Palestinians working for it. That's our first meeting point. The second one is the Holocaust. And I think the Holocaust has not been, as the source of today's anti-Semitism, has not been addressed enough yesterday while we had 2 days ahead. He who suffers brings salvation, according to Christian notions. He who suffers brings salvation, and it cannot be the Jew. Okay, it cannot be, according to Christian Oceans, be a Jew, it has to be someone else. If it is someone else, you have to take the declared suffering of the Jew in the Holocaust and invert it, and put it upside down. Someone else should be the martyr of today. And this is, we've seen the presentation of Professor Milson. Someone else, and this is why the Palestinians are to be found in caricatures and illustrations on the cross. They are on the cross. And if they are on the cross, then the Jew necessarily has to be the Nazi, the one that perpetrated it. Again, it's hard to face, but the Holocaust, instead of generating sympathy to Jews, I think today it is one of the main sources of a demonized image of the Jew. Because if it's Holocaust denial, the queen of Holocaust denial is here. If it is Holocaust denial, then it's a sick mind that has invented such a story. If they concentrate on their own sorrow, they are the ultimate victim and martyr. They are egoists, they don't see others. They are cruel because they have been cruel against, if there is such a verb. Even if there were a Holocaust, and even if there weren't, the outcome of this is that Israel has no right to exist. Because if there were, and they are cruel now, as they have been wronged against, they have no right. Nazis have no right to exist. If there weren't a Holocaust, they certainly don't have any right, because it's one, according to Ahmadinejad, one of the justifications of the state. And I'd like to warn strongly against saying that Israel was based on the Holocaust and out of the ashes, The state was born out of Zionism, okay? And Mikveh Israel was founded in 1860. And had there been no Zionism, the refugees wouldn't have had a place to come to. It wasn't an outcome of the Holocaust, but of Zionist aspirations. And that's to be remembered. Ruth, you spoke yesterday about the fact that here is a United Nations member calling for the destruction of another United Nations member, and no one not only not says a word, but invites him to Colombia and has a dinner in his honor. What I'd like to say, well, I'm a teacher. What I'd like to say is that in order to put forward and advocate a crime as colossal as to wiping out a state, you need the justification of a no less colossal crime, and this is the Holocaust. It is the Holocaust, not politics, and not Middle East, that is behind the possibility to say or to advocate the wiping out of a state. And well, the goal is to take the Holocaust, shadow of the Holocaust off the head of Europe, and you do that by reversing and by advocating through the Holocaust and creating this image. Now I'd like to borrow Danny 1 moment. I'd like to end, I know these are grim prospects, but I'd like to end with a point in which I really answer Ruth, and this is regarding the forefathers of Zionism. You know, we have read, you're right, that they hoped for the creation of a state that would diminish, if not abolish, anti-Semitism. That was the wish, it's written, but it was a wish. They were knowing enough and clever enough, Pinsker and Herzl, we swallowed them at high school, and later they were clever enough to understand that they cannot write on page 20 of the State for the Jewish State, that they would like, that they know that anti-Semitism is deeply rooted for centuries, and then at page 25, wish it would be abolished right after or soon after a state is born. It's not possible. And they knew it wasn't possible. So I read again, not yesterday, but I reread all of them recently, and I would like to say that the word that comes up time and again in Herzl's writings is not abolishing anti-Semitism, but honor, respect. We would be respected. We'll have a state that in which a Jew would be respected. And he was humiliated a number of times, and he didn't forget it, the person of Herzl's stature upbringing. So, I'd like to end with reminding you of a few pages in Amos Oz, סיפור על אהבה וחושך, a story about love and darkness, whom some of you might have read, a fabulous book. And there is this description of the night of the vote in Lake Success, 1947, the vote for petition and the Jewish state. And he describes everyone is out in all streets of almost state Israel, and the result is announced, and he describes a cry not necessarily of joy, but a cry all over. And he's startled, and his father comes to him and says, and Amos Oz says, it was the first and last time I ever saw my father crying. And his father said, when I was a child in Vilna, they took off our pants and mocked us, me and my brother. So the next day came my father and my elder brother to protest, of course, and their pants were taken off as well. Here, said the father to Amos Oz, in the streets of Jerusalem at night, with everyone shouting around. This would not happen here. And this is what the forefathers of Zionism wanted. Thank you.
I don't see any difference with you, but please excuse me. I'm about to have a grandchild.
Anti-Epstein now.
Well, I can't talk now. Actually, I just forgot.
Old age. 2 glasses, what can I say?
First of all, I can't help but thank Charles for his incredible journey he has brought us all on. The fact that we're here in this institution in such numbers, and it's really incredible. Thank you, Charles. The single most important form of anti-Semitism today should be painfully clear. The numbers of people affected and the level of the threat point inexorably one way, to the hate and discrimination directed towards 5.5 million Jews who dare to inhabit and thrive in a Jewish homeland. that tiny parcel of land called Israel. But what should be obvious is not. For modern anti-Semitism thrives because of not one, but two parties: the anti-Semites and the facilitators who cover their tracks. These facilitators aid and abet modern anti-Semitism by denying its application to the Jewish state. They are as disturbing and as dangerous as anti-Semites themselves because they are destroying the fabric of civilization from within, its moral standards, its legal systems, and its international institutions. You know them by other names: the peace activists who promote war, the human rights experts who promote xenophobia, and the academics who promote narrow-minded intolerance. Hypocrisy isn't new, but it's always unsettling. And if there is to be any hope of reversing its contemporary success, it lies with exposing the contradictions, demonstrating the imminent and existential threats posed, and appealing to reason, not in the abstract, but in the minds of November voters, congressional financiers, university hiring committees, and philanthropists. I cannot vote in an American election. I do not have deep pockets, and I have no control over the hiring practices of the ivory tower. But I can lay out before you one of the world's most dangerous contradictions. The United Nations rose from the ashes of the Jewish victims on the promise of never again. Today, it is the leading global sponsor of anti-Semitism. Its destructive force is magnified by a combination of three factors: the vast political energy invested in the organization by the enemies of the Jewish people, the unconditional backing of human rights aficionados claiming to speak for civil society, and the strong support that the institution receives from the Obama administration. The allure of the UN is rooted in its origins, what might be called the siren's call of human rights: universal values, shared principles, and common aspirations which have an hypnotic and inspirational effect. The UN, riding the reputations of early champions such as Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin, captured the globe's collective imagination. Roosevelt became the first chair of the UN's lead human rights body, the Commission on Human Rights, and human rights became the world's strongest ideological currency. Over the decades, however, the Commission's reputation plummeted, and in 2006 it was replaced by the UN Human Rights Council. The Council is emblematic of modern anti-Semitism and its corrosive effect on the moral and legal standards purporting to govern civilized discourse. Let us examine the spectacle of the lead human rights body of the world's leading international organizations. To begin with, a country's actual respect for human rights has nothing to do with its electability to the Council and its resulting influence over international human rights policy. Members include numerous states with among the world's worst human rights records: Saudi Arabia, Kyrgyzstan, Libya, Angola, Cuba, China, and Russia, to name a few. According to Freedom House rankings, less than half of the Council members are fully free democracies. Membership is divided among 5 regional groups, and the African and Asian groups hold the majority. In turn, the member states of the Organization of the Islamic Conference have carefully ensured that elections have given them the majority of each of the African and Asian groups. So they hold the balance of power. Membership has real consequences. From the moment of birth, the Council has had a single dominant aim: the demonization and delegitimization of Israel. Consider the following facts. The Council has a standing agenda of 10 items. One is reserved specifically for condemning Israel. One is for all other 191 UN states. Should anybody consider situations in these states to raise what the agenda calls human rights situations that require the Council's attention. The Council has had 14 regular sessions on human rights issues everywhere, and 6 special sessions to condemn Israel alone. The Council has had only one urgent debate on human rights anywhere. It was dedicated to alleged human rights violations by Israel. The Council has adopted more resolutions and decisions condemning Israel than all other 191 UN states combined. By comparison, countries like Iran, Syria, Zimbabwe, and Libya have never been the subject of a single resolution. The Council currently sponsors 3 investigative bodies on Israel alone, while 184 of the remaining 191 UN members merit nothing at all. Nothing, despite the billions of people affected, for example, by Saudi Arabia's gender apartheid, Egypt's systematic torture, China's iron fist, and Russia's predilection permanently to silence human rights defenders. In fact, in just 4 years, the Council has deliberately terminated investigations or examinations of such human rights models as Cuba, Belarus, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Liberia, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Iran, Turkmenistan, and Guinea. In addition to this staggering array of discrimination and double standards applied only to Israel, the old-fashioned kind of anti-Semitism is never far from the surface of the Council's bogus moral disapprobation. This past June, during the Council's 14th session, the Syrian representative made the following public statement, and I'm quoting, "Israel is a state that is built on hatred. Let me quote a song that a group of children on a school bus in Israel sing merrily as they go to school, and I quote, 'With my teeth I will rip your flesh, with my mouth I will suck your blood.'" End of quote. What was the response? The President of the Council, Belgian Ambassador Alex van Leeuwen, was in the chair during this crude and unmistakable blood libel. Finding nothing unusual in the speech, he said, "Thank you," before turning his attention to the next speaker. Lest you make any mistake, he had alternatives. Ambassador Van Leeuwen has previously had no difficulty interrupting or castigating speakers, myself included, for failure to exhibit what he calls dignity, tolerance, and respect, none of which he applied to the Syrian. Turning the Council into a platform for anti-Semitism, therefore, took 2, the Syrian and the European Union ambassador, the anti-Semite and his or her enabler. The Council's record was clear when the President of the United States decided to grant it American support. In one of his first international policy moves, President Obama insisted that the United States become a member of the Council and committed U.S. taxpayers to pay 22% of its operating budget. Now an active member, the U.S. lends the Council dangerous anti-human rights and anti-Semitic activities the cover of legitimacy. Administration representatives periodically claim that a U.S. presence improves the chances of reforming the Council. Now that a scheduled 5-year review is underway, it is clear to all participants that those who control the Council and the General Assembly have no interest in reform, while the U.S. is perceived as carrying 0 political weight in this context. The reform excuse is pure fiction. So the world of international human rights presents a noxious mixture of anti-Semites working alongside those who profess disgust, but signal cooperation. The series of UN investigations now proceeding on the Gaza war and the flotilla episodes offer 2 good examples of the yin and yang of anti-Semitism in current international politics. In late 2008 and early 2009, Israel finally responded to 8 years of rocket attacks emanating from Gaza against its civilian population. The UN responded too. After standing on the sidelines during conflicts that have resulted in the deaths, rape, homelessness, and persecution of hundreds of thousands around the world. It went on an unprecedented 3-week blitz to terminate Israel's right to act in self-defense. In 3 weeks, it held an emergency session of the General Assembly and a special session of the Human Rights Council. It adopted a Security Council resolution, a General Assembly resolution, and a Human Rights Council resolution. The General Assembly president at the time, Miguel Vizcarra Brockman of Nicaragua, held a news conference. And this is what he began with, quote, "Most of my very dearest friends are Jewish people," unquote. And then he went on to display a photo of what he said were some rabbis from an Orthodox community in Jerusalem holding a sign reading, "Stop the Massacre in Gaza." "Is this a fake?" he asked rhetorically. He then went on to claim Israelis were like Nazis and suggested anti-Semitism meant something other than Jew hatred, and I'm quoting him. Talking about Israel, he said, "All dictatorships, including Hitler, claim that those who criticize us hated the Nazis. All dictators do the same, and so also here. The Palestinians, are they not also Semites?" This is the President of the General Assembly. As an aside, this individual, after he's finished his term as the President of the General Assembly, was appointed a member of the UN's Human Rights Council Special Advisory Committee on Human Rights. The United States member of the Council said not one word in objection to his nomination and approval. Frenzied condemnations came from across the UN in the middle of the Gaza war. Dozens of statements were produced by the Secretary General, UNRWA, UN representatives on women, children, armed conflict, UNICEF, the World Food Program, UNESCO, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Nadia Pillay. But most importantly to note, these activities were part of a much broader scheme, unrelated to ending the war and totally unrelated to ending the rocket attacks. Essentially, the goal of the political actors driving this assault is to make the Israeli resort to self-defense illegitimate. This has meant keeping the Gaza war, like the flotilla episode, on the front burner of the international legal establishment. In the short time I have, I can only sketch the steps involved in this process, but they take a well-trodden path. It begins with a resolution demanding a so-called investigation of a subject upon which the body in charge has already declared guilt or innocence. The reports of Israel's guilt are duly produced, and a new round of resolutions then demands follow-up of the reports. So on the Gaza war, there was a Human Rights Council resolution demanding a report from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and a, quote, urgent independent international fact-finding mission to investigate all violations of international human rights law by the occupying power Israel against the Palestinian people, end of quote. The report from the High Commissioner for Human Rights was duly entitled "The Grave Violations of Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, particularly due to the recent Israeli military attacks against the occupied Gaza Strip." It directs its recommendations specifically only to Israel without even naming Hamas. Then came the report of the Urgent Fact-Finding Mission, also known as the Goldstone Report. Goldstone and the other 3 members of his team had each publicly declared Israel guilty of crimes before they were even appointed. The Goldstone Report is a classic example of the workings of modern anti-Semitism. The central abomination in this report, cutting right to the chase here, it's 500 pages long, is its finding that Israel, quote, deliberately terrorized a civilian population. Israeli violence against civilians was part of a deliberate policy. This is not an accusation that mistakes were made in the course of war, or that the force used in response to years of rocket attacks against Israel's own civilian population was somehow disproportionate. It is the suggestion that instead of being motivated by self-defense, Israel set out to murder the very people most deserving of protection. The claim that Israel aimed to kill civilians is reminiscent of a lie from another century, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. For in effect, The Goldstone report repeats this ancient blood libel, the allegation of bloodthirsty Jews intent on butchering the innocent. The allegation is not only false and defamatory, of course, it has given a green light to hate and terror directed towards Israelis. At the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, the Goldstone report has licensed a firestorm of hate speech, all of which is webcast around the globe, translated into multiple languages, and permanently archived for your students and others around the world. Speaker after speaker claimed Israel is, and I'm just quoting them all, guilty of crimes against humanity, willful killings, brutal massacres, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and a policy of extermination against the Palestinian people. This kind of language was never intended to be an abstraction, and like so many believe the United Nations is somehow just hot air. The punchline and the point of the UN commissioning the Goldstone report has always been in plain sight, the denial of Israel's right to exist. As a Libyan representative put it, Zionist crimes in Palestine began with the arrival of the first Zionist settlers in Palestine. They're not something new, and they've become systematic since the establishment of what is called Israel. These Zionist occupiers have used every form and method of terror against Palestinians for over 60 years. End of quote. There were no interruptions, no call to order, no repercussions for challenging the legitimacy of a UN member state. On the contrary, the Goldstone report has only been magnified since. The year-old Goldstone report was first released in September of last year, is now the focus of a new UN team, tasked with the job of reporting on its implementation. In many ways, the new team headed by German lawyer Christian Tomaschott is even more threatening than the original, since it is charged with reviewing the bona fides of Israel's entire legal system. The Tomaschott Committee is asking the question whether Israel's judicial system is capable of adequately, in their estimation, responding to Goldstone's findings of violations of international law, by which is meant only one thing: are Israeli political and military actors being arrested, tried, and convicted? If this is not done by the Israeli judicial system, Tomaschott has already suggested it must be accomplished by other states. And in fact, the Goldstone report has already fueled attempts to prosecute Israeli leaders in such places as the United Kingdom. We need to label the campaign to confront Jews, physically assault them through false arrest and incarceration, for what it is. We are witnessing the launch of a modern-day pogrom against the individuals at the helm of Jewish self-determination. Although I don't have much time, I'll just point to the flotilla episode. It began at the end of May with Israel's attempt to prevent the establishment of what would be an Iranian port on the Mediterranean through stopping Turkish-backed extremists from ending the blockade, from breaking the blockade. Within 24 hours, with an unprecedented speed, the Security Council adopted a presidential statement calling for the establishment of an independent and impartial investigation. The Obama administration approved of that security. It could only have a presidential statement. It could only have been issued unanimously. So within 24 hours, they jump on the bandwagon. Then Israel decided to create its own investigation and in an unprecedented manner added 2 international observers to its investigative team in response to the Obama administration's members' various suggestions that somehow an Israeli-only team in a democratic society governed by the rule of law was inadequate. But that wasn't sufficient. Within another 24 hours, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution and created a new investigative team of its own making. Then what happened? That was in June. The Obama administration kept the pressure up on Israel. They said that even the investigative team with 2 Israeli participants was insufficient, and they insisted that Israel cooperate with the creation of a Secretary General's investigative team. The negotiations went on back and forth. Israel strongly resisted the creation of yet another investigation of the flotilla episode, which, bear in mind, resulted in the deaths of 9 people, as opposed to the hundreds of deaths which have happened in the intervening period around the world, hundreds and thousands around the world. Eventually, through political suasion, which only the United States, of course, is capable of, Israel capitulated and, against, I think, the judgment of many, agreed to participate in this Secretary General's investigation. So now we have a classic case of double jeopardy. Human Rights Council investigation. I should say one other thing, and that is U.S. UN Ambassador Susan Rice stated when Israel agreed to participate in the Secretary General's investigation of the flotilla that the Human Rights Council investigation was now redundant and unnecessary, and suggested that it would disappear, both to Israelis and in her public statements. And obviously, the United States was completely incapable of ensuring that result. And in fact, the Human Rights Council resolution investigative team has already begun and has in fact met in Geneva and is now going to various parts of the Middle East, so far excluding Israel. So what you have is a classic case of double jeopardy. Israel is subject to the Israeli investigation, the Human Rights Council investigation, and a Secretary General's investigation. Secretary General's investigation, by the way, called for a first report in the middle of September. No accident, because that is when all the presidents and prime ministers around the globe will convene in New York and at the same moment, so that this preliminary investigative report will be available to them at that time for, no doubt, future pressures being brought to bear upon Israel. So that's the flotilla investigation. But what I would say is point out one other thing as an aside, and that is the Durban reference. The Durban reference, the Durban declaration we know all about, but what you may not be aware of is that the Obama administration has reversed policy on the Durban outcome and follow-up procedure. There will be a 10th anniversary of the Durban conference at the 2011 opening of the General Assembly, of which the United States has refused to, in a resolution which was adopted by the Human Rights Council in June, refused to object to that, to the convening of that so-called celebration. So this is the face of modern anti-Semitism, denying Israel the right to fight back, eliminating the Jewish state by lethal politics, by perverting law in order to deny equality, by appropriating the language of human rights in the cause of perpetuating human rights abuse. And I think that just as the world of anti-Semitism is now entrenched in lethal politics, the response must be to exercise the appropriate political responses in this country and in any other countries where you have the right to vote. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone, for a stimulating panel. And now we will take a break and reconvene at 11:00.
About the Holocaust. Dosa's use of the term denial/skepticism is designed to further this goal. It is interesting to note, just as an aside, that deniers themselves may be gravitating away from use of the term revisionist, precisely because it has become so closely linked to denial. For their purposes, it's become almost toxic. In his report on the Iran conference, Australian Holocaust denier Fred Tobin includes the following caption in bold: "Note, conference theme, a review, not a revision of the Holocaust." Not surprisingly, Dosa tries to give Ahmadinejad cover by claiming that Ahmadinejad is doing exactly what the Jewish scholars, other Jewish scholars such as Tom Segev, have been doing for years. As critical as Segev has been about Israeli politics, he has never, ever echoed anything of Ahmadinejad's sentiments about the Holocaust. But again, it's an attempt to give themselves cover as scholarly skeptics. Then Dosa goes on to argue that not only is Ahmadinejad not a liar, but this wasn't a Holocaust denial conference. It was, in fact, a, quote, global South conference designed to devise an intellectual political response to Western Israeli intervention in Muslim affairs, not Western. He asserts that the presence of a, quote, few notorious Western Christian deniers/skeptics, a couple of neo-Nazis, were used to brand the conference as a denial gathering, when in fact Holocaust deniers were a fringe element. Was this indeed a global conference on Western Israeli intervention in Muslim affairs? Judging from a copy of the program, and you have here just a few of the people. Okay, forget it. The long list shows, and I'm just going to show you the list of topics, and of course over 1/3 of them are direct in the title. Holocaust, Treblinka was not a death camp, the Holocaust demography, talk on the scientific lack of basis for the 6 million figure, gas chamber fraud. Anybody could read this program and then say that this is not a Holocaust denial conference, is either, as Ibbotson said, a liar or an idiot. But it was not just the papers and the participants that give the lie to Dosa's claims about the nature of the gathering. Even the exhibits, there were exhibits too. As one reporter described them, they largely supported the view the Holocaust did not take place or was exaggerated. They had pictures, and next to each picture was myth, truth, myth, truth. A student at Tehran University who helped set up the exhibition told the press between 150,000 and 300,000 Jews died because of natural causes of war, such as famine and air raids. Unfortunately, Iranian schools still teach the official history dictated by the West, but we are campaigning to change that. Then Dosa goes on to argue that the Iranian government didn't sponsor the conference, but it was sponsored by a political science think tank in Iran. When you go on the website of the political science think tank, the logo shows right underneath a unit of the foreign ministry of Iran. So that also sets things, clearly puts the lie to Dosa's claim. Finally, Dosa protests in his essay, there was no way he could have known that a few deniers would be in attendance. In fact, in January 2006, fully 11 months before the conference, a spokesman for the foreign ministry in Iran told the press this would be a conference to examine the scientific basis supporting the Holocaust. He goes on to later to say, right before the conference, the Holocaust is not a sacred issue that one cannot touch. I have visited Nazi camps in Eastern Europe. I think it is exaggerated. This is coming from the foreign ministry. And finally, even Al Jazeera, a source that Dosa might find more trustworthy than Canada's Globe and Mail, reported that this was going to be a Holocaust denial conference. In the essence of his essay, Dosa argues that the virulent attack on him for attending the conference was motivated by Islamophobia. He says it began with two Globe and Mail journalists whom he describes in decidedly non-academic language as, quote, dilettantes extraordinaire on the Holocaust in the Middle East, who got most things wrong, displayed cerebral deficits, and were intellectually just a cut above the trailer park boys, to whom the paper has given unlimited latitude, this is the journalist, not the trailer park boy, to trash Muslims even as they defend civilization, Israel, and Jews. Then he goes on to say that the attack on him by the university was a way of the university showing that it's on the side of the Jews and not on the side of the Muslims. He then goes on to argue that Ahmadinejad didn't attend the conference. Of course, there are pictures of him attending he didn't attend, the conference went to him, and of course he gave official welcome, etc., etc. So again, that is completely a fallacy in Dosa's claims. But the heart of the matter is what happened afterwards. First of all, this essay is published in the Literary Review of Canada, and he is given support by the Canadian Association of University Professors, which is far more important, because Dosa ultimately is an irrelevant and unimportant figure who seems to have earned more column inches and attention by his few days in Tehran than anything he has done, certainly in the scholarly realm. Rather than simply saying, I went and I made a mistake, he has engaged in a convoluted effort to rewrite history and cast himself as a victim of so-called Islamophobia. His attempt to refashion the truth, as comical as it is at times, is in fact more important than his presence at this gathering. It constitutes what I've termed soft-core denial. Soft-core denial is more nuanced and amorphous than the outright denial one hears from people like Khorisan or David Irving. By contending that people such as Ahmadinejad are not engaging in denial, Dosa is trying to politicize any criticism of Ahmadinejad and his cohorts. It is not, he seems to be arguing, but a means of attacking Muslims and defending Israel. But far more disturbing, and this is really the heart of my argument, than Dosa's response was the behavior of the Literary Review of Canada, which published the essay, and CAUT, the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which issued a strong statement in support of Dosa. The reporter of the
We have a panel this morning which is, all of you have gathered at the heart of the concerns of the conference, contemporary anti-Semitism and the delegitimization of Israel. I'm Danny Goldhagen, and I will just be up here briefly as we have a panel of people who need little or no introduction. The first thing I should say is that there was a typo in the program, and Ann Majewski, who is listed as the first person in the next panel, is actually, and always has been, a part of our panel, so she'll be speaking during this session. I'll be brief in the introductions. As you know, there are fuller biographies in the program for everyone, and Walter Wright, who has a very attenuated biography, his fuller biography can be found on the George Washington website. The first person will be, I will introduce everyone, and then they will come up and tell you what they have to say about their areas of expertise. The first person is someone who has done more to combat and constrain Holocaust deniers than anyone. There's no doubt about this, and who has done so heroically. And so we are very, very lucky to have Deborah Lipstadt here to speak about the subject about which no one can speak with more authority, and that is the Iranian president, the Canadian professor, the literary journal, and the Holocaust denial conference that never was. Following Deborah is the former head of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, someone who knows from the inside more about the politics of the study of the Holocaust and the nexus of that with the discussion of Israel than probably just about anybody, or certainly up there with anybody, Walter Wright, who will be speaking about the rabbi and the president don't give us the Holocaust at the expense of Israel. Following him, we have Dina Porat, who, in addition to her many publications and achievements, is the director of the Stephen Roth Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism and Racism in Tel Aviv, and who puts out what is probably the single most important annual survey of anti-Semitism around the world, their annual yearbook. And so it can speak as authoritatively as anyone about, are the events in the Middle East indeed the source of the global new anti-Semitism? And finally, we have the person who has done more to keep an eye on the UN, who has a column, a dispatch and analysis of the proceedings and goings-on of the UN with regard to Israel and human rights that is a must-read for anyone who would like to keep up on this subject. It's called Eye on the UN. Ann Bayevsky, who, with her unparalleled authority on the subject, will be telling us about anti-Semitism and the international human rights system. So we have a full panel, and we'll just get immediately to Deborah with the others following her one after another. Thank you.
The list of attendees at the Iranian Holocaust Denial Conference in December 2006 constituted a virtual who's who of Holocaust deniers and anti-Semites, including Roberto YIISA, one of the leading theorists, so to speak, of the movement, Australian Fred Tobin, whose Adelaide Institute is a bastion of denial activities, former Ku Klux Klan leader David Duke, and Bradley Smith, founder of CODO, Committee on Open Debate on the Holocaust. However, there was one name which caught many people by surprise. Shiraz Dosa, a faculty member at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia, a respected academic institution. It was not his lofty standing in the field of Holocaust studies which surprised people. In fact, few people, certainly those in the field of Holocaust studies, had any idea who he was. What gave people pause was that Dosa was a tenured faculty member at a legitimate academic institution. Was this, I wondered, an Arthur Butz redux? Butz, who teaches at Northwestern, is the professor of electrical engineering, whose book, The Hopes of the 20th Century, tried to cloak denial in an academic garb. This might be, some people surmised, even more disturbing than the Butz situation, since Butz is an electrical engineer, and as one pundit quipped, he knows as much about the Holocaust as I do about building bridges, and who has no ostensible expertise in Holocaust history. Dosa, on the other hand, was a political philosopher, and as such was at least obliquely an irrelevant. Shiraz Dosa, a Google search quickly revealed, had an MA and PhD from the University of Toronto. Born, according to his rather self-deprecating St. Francis Xavier webpage, in an unnamed, quote, multiracial British colony in Africa, close quote, has apparently published one book on Hannah Arendt's political philosophy, which contains approximately 8 pages on the Holocaust. Though Dosa describes himself as a Holocaust expert or scholar, his list of publications contain few or if any items related to the topic. Upon his return to Canada, this conference seems to have a strange Canadian theme, for better and now for worse. Upon his return to Canada, he was subjected to a barrage of criticism from many quarters, including the leadership of his university, who described his participation in the conference as abhorrent. Dosa claimed that he was surprised to find that this was a denial conference, and dismissed the deniers who were there as, quote, hacks and lunatics. His claim to have been unaware that this was a Holocaust denial conference led John Ibbotson, a columnist in the Globe and Mail, to declare that Dosa was either an idiot or lying. And Ibbotson called for Dosa's firing. A few months later, Dosa struck back with an extensive essay in a small but apparently respected online journal, the Literary Review of Canada. Using language that was pregnant with religious overtones, he lamented the, quote, Spanish Inquisition and Crusade sanctioned by the school and designed to denounce him, a Muslim scholar and Muslim Holocaust scholar. He added, in a seemingly parenthetical observation, who also happens to be an outspoken critic of Israel's brutality in occupied Palestine. The crusade was, he charged, launched by 2 Jewish professors and the Christian chair of the political science department. His use of the term crusade to stress on the religious identity of the so-called inquisitors, and his emphasis that this fight was launched against a Muslim professor were not inconsequential. Even the cover of the journal, which proclaimed a Muslim scholar speaks his mind, picked up on the theme of religious identity. Though designed to be a brief on his own behalf, the essay in fact provides insight in what might have motivated this professor of political theory to participate in such a gathering. The essay alters Dosa's attendance at the conference from an enigma to something rational, if not quite logical. After reading his essay, his participation in the gathering no longer confounded me. Other aspects of this episode, however, remain quite baffling. Now first, a couple of things about his essay itself. Dosa begins by challenging what he describes as 2 fallacies about Ahmadinejad. One, was that he threatened to wipe Israel off the map, and the second, that he was a Holocaust denier. In a paragraph that is either very poorly edited or designed to obfuscate, Dosa writes, the anti-intellectual storm at St. Francis was driven by two fallacies pushed by the media and the literati. The first is that Iran's president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, has dismissed the Holocaust as a myth and threatened to wipe Israel off the map. In fact, this is Dosa speaking, Ahmadinejad has not denied the Holocaust or proposed Israel's liquidation. He has never done so in any of his speeches on the subject, all delivered in Farsi. As an Iranian specialist, I can attest that both accusations are false. And then his proof, and then his further support. He goes on to say, American Iran experts such as Juan Cole and UK journalists such as Jonathan Steele have come to the same conclusion. While Ahmadinejad's statements about wiping Israel off the map has been challenged by both Cole and Steele, both of whom go to great linguistic lengths to try to make it sound benign, make Ahmadinejad sound benign, neither of them have had anything to say about Ahmadinejad's Holocaust denial. It is unclear whether Professor Dosa wants his readers to believe that Cole and Steele have also challenged the idea that Ahmadinejad is a denier, which they have not, or is he simply expressing himself in a very sloppy fashion. Dosa then goes on to claim that Ahmadinejad has not denied the Holocaust. He has never done so. While he acknowledges that Ahmadinejad's language has been excessive and provocative, he seems to suggest that this is a rational, if not laudatory characteristic. Quote, he does not really care what we in the West think about Iran or Muslims. He does not kowtow to Western or Israeli diktat. Close quote. According to Dosa, Ahmadinejad has been questioning the mythologizing, the sacralization of the Holocaust and raises doubts about its scale. Repeatedly in the essay, Dosa refers not to Holocaust denier, but to Holocaust denial / skepticism. Since skepticism is precisely the approach scholars are supposed to adopt, Dosa's use of the term suggests that deniers are part of the scholarly enterprise. Dosa is not, of course, the first one to try to depict deniers as simply inquisitive folks. He is, in fact, echoing the claim deniers have been making for the past 30 years. Calling themselves, quote-unquote, revisionists, they insist that their primary objective is to correct mistakes in history. They wish to be thought of as, quote, an other side in the scholarly conversation